Sound Words. Christian Magazine. Volumes 41 to 50. Republished by Irving Risch, host of Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. Exodus, the Book of Redemption and Relationship. A Shepherd. We will go through the entire book in 24 parts. Part 2 of 24. Exodus chapter 1. The condition in which the children of Israel are found in Exodus chapter 1 had been foretold many years before, when God had declared to Abraham, "Know assuredly that thy seed will be a sojourner in a land that is not theirs, and they shall be in bondage to them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. But also that nation which they shall serve I will judge, and afterward they shall come out with great property." Genesis chapter 15 verses 13 to 14. This is the history of the first 12 chapters of Exodus, and so at the first chapter we are brought to the very threshold of the accomplishment of God's ways with his people, as foretold to Abraham. Even the wrath of man is yoked to the chariot wheels of God's decrees, just as when Christ was given up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, to men to crucify and slay. Acts chapter 2 verse 23. The brief summary of particulars relating to Jacob and his sons who went with him down to Egypt, is dealt with in greater detail in Genesis chapter 46. No mention is made in these introductory verses of the famine in Canaan, which was the immediate cause of the going down to Egypt. But in the light of further revelation, this was no fortuitous circumstance in their history, but part of God's providential ways to effect his purpose concerning them. It was an intolerable thought that the children of Israel, owned of God as his people in covenant relationship with him, should be found in servile bondage under the heel of this cruel, tyrannical despot. Since Egypt speaks of the world in its deep-seated enmity towards the people of God, Pharaoh as its prince would speak of him who is the adversary and oppressor of those who belong to Christ, and of whom Christ said, "The ruler of this world comes, and in me he has nothing." John chapter 14 verse 30. This is the one who seeks to keep us in a state of continual bondage, and so prevent us from enjoying what God has given to us. A radical change marks the circumstances of the children of Israel when there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. No longer were they the favored recipients of Joseph's bounty as preserved and nourished under his beneficent administration. They were made to feel the power of one who was the avowed adversary of Jehovah and his people. In its spiritual application, however, we, as the people of God, while still in the scene where the claims of Christ are still refused, and the usurper wields his baneful influence and destructive power, are preserved and nourished by the heavenly ministrations of our true Joseph from his exalted place on God's throne. We are reminded that the children of Israel, every man and his household, came with Jacob. The natural name of their father appears here in perfect suitability to the Spirit's purpose, just as we came into the house of bondage with our father, Adam. God, in the sovereign actings of his grace, as we shall see, alone can deliver us from the thraldom of a greater rebel than Pharaoh. The bondage itself, however, does not begin at once, for conscious bondage is not the expression of our mere natural state. The man in Romans chapter 7 is not a mere child of nature, for such does not cry out, "Oh, wretched man that I am! Who shall deliver me?" That is an expression of felt bondage. There was the time when this world pleased us well enough, just as there was a time when Egypt pleased the children of Israel, but God, in faithfulness remembering his covenant with Abraham, commences to forge the various links in the remarkable chain of circumstances, which would free them from Egypt with its lusts and bondage. God saw what was necessary to bring home to his people their need of deliverance, and raised up Pharaoh to procure the smoking furnace of Abraham's vision. Genesis chapter 15. Egypt became to them a house of bondage, the clear reflection of our own moral condition as sinners, a condition in which we should have remained had it not been for the sovereign intervention of God in mercy. In his wisdom, God allows us to feel the mighty burden of our sin and guilt, and taste the bitterness of our bondage to the ruler of this world, and thus by reason of our felt condition, cry unto him. Listen to the words of Exodus chapter 2 verses 23 to 25, "And the children of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and cried, and God heard, and God remembered, and God looked upon the children of Israel. And God took knowledge of their state." Further, in Exodus chapter 3 verses 7 to 8, Jehovah said, "I have seen their cry, I have heard. I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them." What a wonderful moment it was in the world's history when God came down in the person of Jesus to effect our deliverance. This book opens with the significant words, "And these are the names of the sons of Israel," a title suggestive of the dignity as standing in relation to the prince with God, would this not suggest to us the place of dignity and liberty to which God has called his saints? How this thought is illuminated with divine light, as the beloved apostle declares in Galatians chapter 4 verses 4 to 7, God sent forth his Son, that he might redeem those under law, that we might receive sonship. But because ye are sons, God hath sent out the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So thou art no longer bondman, but son, heir also through God. Bondage is inconsistent with the place of sons, and the enemy in his malice and fury would fain hold us under his power. The enemy knows that the presence of the children of God in this world constitutes an ever-present danger to his kingdom, and he has sought by means of persecution, and by the introduction of legal principles, to bring us into a false position. In Acts 15 and Galatians, we see the enemy at work, endeavoring to entice the saints into unprofitable labor, unworthy of those who have been delivered out of this present evil age. In building the store cities of Pharaoh, which were used to provision his army, the children of Israel were but riveting the chains of slavery more firmly on themselves. The enemy, in seeking to hinder the increase and prosperity of the children of Israel, gave his commands to the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, but these faithful women disobeyed the king. Because they feared God, they were prospered by him. Like these faithful women, the Apostle Paul sought the increase and spiritual prosperity of God's people. He travailed over the Galatian saints, 4 verse 19, who were in danger of being brought into legal bondage. His combat was great for the saints at Colossus and elsewhere, lest they should be ensnared by the principles of the world. How richly compensating is the sense of God's favor to those who are seeking to move in the current of his thoughts with respect to his people's spiritual increase and enlargement in the knowledge of those momentous truths which are secured in all the stability of his eternal counsels. These great truths have been revealed, and remain for the people of God to form and give character to their path, so that while conscious of the immeasurable resources that abide in Christ, they might in sweet communion enter into the enjoyment of all God's thoughts regarding Christ and the assembly.